August 1944. The island of Kauai, Hawaii. The Pacific sun hung heavy and white in a sky of bruised cobalt, casting long, sharp shadows across the red volcanic earth of the prisoner of war enclosure. Inside the perimeter of the barbed wire, the air was thick with the scent of salt spray, eucalyptus, and the metallic tang of the fencing. There was a peculiar, unnatural stillness to the camp, a silence that felt heavier than the tropical humidity. 200 men in tattered, olive-drab fatigue sat or stood in small, motionless clusters. They did not speak. They did not gamble. They did not plot. They moved with the ghostly lethargy of men who had already accepted their own funerals. To the American guards watching from the towers, these men were an enigma of stoicism. To the men themselves, they were the living dead, ghosts trapped in a purgatory of their own cultural making. This profound silence was the direct result of a collision between two irreconcilable worlds. By 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had turned into a relentless surge of American industrial might, yet for the Japanese soldier, the physical defeat was secondary to the spiritual catastrophe of capture. The Imperial Japanese Army's Field Service Code, the Senjinkan, was not merely a set of regulations, it was a psychological shackle. Its most famous tenet, *do not live to endure the shame of imprisonment*, dictated that a soldier had only two honorable paths, victory or death. By falling into enemy hands, whether through injury, exhaustion, or the sheer chaos of combat, these men had effectively committed a social and familial suicide. In their minds, they had ceased to exist. They were no longer sons of Japan. They were stains upon the honor of their ancestors, shadows that had failed to merge with the soil of the motherland. The transition from the hellish, sulphurous ridges of Saipan or the mud-choked jungles of New Guinea to the orderly, sun-drenched confines of a Hawaiian camp was a jarring dislocation. On the front lines, the Japanese soldier had been told that the Americans were blue-eyed devils, monsters who would torture or execute those who surrendered. They expected the bayonet or the firing squad. Instead, they found themselves in a place of surreal, clinical efficiency. They were washed, fed, and housed in barracks that were often sturdier than the homes they had left behind in the prefectures of Honshu or Kyushu. This benevolence was not met with gratitude, but with a deep, gnawing suspicion. They viewed the clean bandages on their wounds and the structured routine of the camp as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to soften their resolve. Among the prisoners, the shame was a physical weight. Many had provided false names to their captors, choosing the identities of dead comrades or invented personas to ensure that no record of their survival would ever reach their home villages. To have a name on a POW list was to bring a death in disgrace notification to one's parents. It was better to be a nameless casualty, a hero who died in a bonsai charge, than a living son in a cage. They sat in the Hawaiian sun, watching the American transport planes drone overhead, feeling the absolute isolation of the forgotten. They were men without a country and men without a future, waiting for a conclusion to a life they believed had already ended the moment the American hands had closed around their wrists. Within this atmosphere of static despair, the Americans maintained a standard of living that seemed like a hallucination of wealth. The Japanese soldiers, who had spent months surviving on handfuls of maggot-ridden rice and the moisture from moss, now watched as American privates threw away more food in a day than a Japanese village consumed in a week. This abundance was represented most poignantly by a single, recurring object, the heavy, white porcelain mug. Every morning, each prisoner was issued a mug of steaming, dark coffee. The ceramic was thick, smooth, and impossibly white, a symbol of a civilization that had so much material wealth it could afford to give its dishonored enemies the luxury of heat and porcelain. To the prisoner, the mug was a constant, silent reminder of the democratic machine's capacity. It was a weapon of comfort that began to erode the edges of their indoctrinated hate. The silence of the camp was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath. The prisoners lived in a state of suspended animation, refusing to look toward the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the world beyond the wire. They were waiting for the end of the world, or at least the end of their part in it. They did not know that the American authorities, in conjunction with the International Red Cross, were preparing a gesture that would do what the firebombings and the naval salvos could not. It would break the internal fortress of the Japanese spirit. They were about to be offered a bridge back to the land of the living, a bridge made of nothing more than thin paper and ink, and it would prove to be the most terrifying trial they had yet faced. The stillness of the Kauai camp was underpinned by a rigid, invisible architecture, the psychological scaffolding of the Showa era. To understand the profound paralysis of the men sitting in the Hawaiian sun, one must look back to the winter of 1941, when General Hideki Tojo issued the Senjinkan. This document was more than a military manual, it was a spiritual contract that rewrote the definition of human value. It explicitly stated that one must not suffer the shame of being taken prisoner. In the eyes of the High Command, and subsequently in the eyes of the Japanese public, a soldier captured by the enemy was a non-entity. He was a ghost who had failed to execute the final duty of self-destruction. This cultural mandate created a unique type of prisoner, one who did not seek escape, but rather a quiet place to wither away. The soldiers held in Hawaii had been plucked from a world where the collective was everything and the individual was nothing. In the Japanese Imperial Army, the individual's life was described as being lighter than a feather, while duty to the emperor was heavier than a mountain. This ideology created a terrifying resilience on the battlefield, but it left the soldier completely unequipped for survival behind barbed wire. When an American soldier was captured, his duty was to survive, to resist, and eventually to return home to a hero's welcome. When a Japanese soldier was captured, he believed he had committed a crime against his bloodline. He was convinced that his family would be ostracized, his parents stripped of their pensions, and his children marked with a permanent stain of cowardice. This fear manifested in a widespread, desperate campaign of anonymity. Upon arrival at the processing centers, hundreds of prisoners lied about their identities. A corporal from Okayama would claim to be a private from a different unit who had perished in the jungles. They gave the names of mountains, of dead friends, or made-up aliases. By erasing their true names, they were attempting to protect their families from the shame of their survival. They wanted their mothers to receive a small wooden box containing a few pebbles or a lock of hair, the symbolic remains of a fallen hero, rather than a letter stating their son was eating 3 meals a day in an American camp. They were protecting the honor of the dead by pretending they were among them. The American intelligence officers, many of whom were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, understood this pathology. They watched as the prisoners practiced a form of social withdrawal known as enryo, a profound restraint or holding back. The prisoners would not look their captors in the eye, not out of defiance, but out of a deep-seated sense of unworthiness. They felt they had no right to occupy space, to breathe the air, or to consume the rations provided by the enemy. This was the fortress of the mind, a mental barricade built on the belief that the Japanese spirit was superior to Western materialism, even as that spirit was being crushed by the weight of its own unforgiving codes. Every day, this fortress was bombarded by the sheer normalcy of the American environment. The prisoners observed the American guards with a mixture of horror and fascination. The guards were relaxed, they laughed, they leaned against the fence posts, and they treated their equipment with a casual familiarity that bordered on sacrilege to the disciplined Japanese mind. Most confusing was the American attitude toward the prisoners themselves. Instead of the expected brutality, the Americans displayed a baffling, almost insulting, indifference to the prisoners' shame. The Americans saw them as men to be managed, fed, and cataloged according to the Geneva Convention, a document that the Japanese government had never formally ratified and which the soldiers did not understand. The recurring symbol of the white porcelain mug became the focal point of this cultural friction. While the Japanese soldier viewed his life as a disposable tool for the state, the American system treated the prisoner as a biological entity with rights to comfort. To hold the heavy, warm ceramic was to hold a piece of a world that valued the individual's physical existence. The steam rising from the coffee was a sensory contradiction to the cold, dark void the Senjinkan demanded they inhabit. The fortress was strong, reinforced by years of indoctrination and the fear of a shamed homecoming, but it was beginning to show microscopic cracks. The Americans were not fighting the prisoners with steel, but with the quiet, persistent pressure of humanity, preparing the ground for the moment the living dead would be asked to speak to the world they had abandoned. By the autumn of 1944, the physical contrast between the life the prisoners had left and the life they now endured had become an assault on their senses. In the Japanese Imperial Army, logistics were often treated as a secondary concern to spirit. Soldiers were expected to live off the land, which in the barren volcanic caves of the Pacific meant a slow descent into scurvy, beriberi, and starvation. They had been men who fought over a single rotted sweet potato. Now, in the camps of Hawaii and the American mainland, they were confronted with a logistics machine that seemed to possess the power of a minor deity. The American excess was not merely a matter of quantity, but of a casual, systemic abundance that the Japanese mind struggled to categorize. This abundance was most visible in the mess halls. The prisoners watched in stunned silence as crates of tinned beef, mountains of white bread, and sacks of sugar were unloaded daily. To the Japanese soldier, who had been told that the American home front was collapsing under the weight of the war, this display of wealth was a devastating blow to their propaganda-fed worldview. They saw American privates, men of the lowest rank, smoking tailor-made cigarettes and wearing boots that were sturdier than those issued to Japanese officers. The psychological impact was profound. It suggested that the democracy they were fighting was not a decadent, dying system, but an industrial titan that could feed its enemies better than the empire could feed its heroes. At the center of this sensory overload was the recurring symbol of the white porcelain mug. It was ubiquitous, heavy, and seemingly indestructible. In the Japanese military, equipment was meager and handled with a religious, frantic care, for there were no replacements. Yet here, the American guards handled their porcelain with a nonchalant ease. Every morning, the prisoners were led to long wooden tables where a mug awaited each of them. It was filled with coffee, sweetened with real sugar and lightened with evaporated milk, luxuries that had vanished from civilian life in Tokyo years prior. The warmth of the ceramic against their palms was more than a physical comfort. It was a subversion of their loyalty. Each sip of the dark, rich brew was a taste of a world that prioritized the individual's basic satisfaction over the state's demand for sacrifice. The emotional contrast was sharpening into a painful edge. The prisoners felt a rising sense of betrayal, not toward their captors, but toward the leadership that had sent them into the jungles to die of hunger while claiming the enemy was weak. They looked at their own filling bellies and their healing skin with a sense of mounting guilt. Under the Bushido Code, a pampered prisoner was a double traitor, first for surviving and second for enjoying the sustenance of the conqueror. They would often sit for hours staring into the depths of their coffee, the dark liquid reflecting faces that were becoming healthy even as their spirits remained fractured. This abundance was also a form of isolation. The more the Americans provided, the further the prisoners felt drifted from the reality of their families in Japan. They imagined their wives and children lining up for meager rations of sawdust-filled bread while they, the cowards, were eating meat and fruit. The porcelain mug became a weight of gold, a treasure they felt they had no right to hold. It represented a standard of living that was inextricably linked to the democratic ideal, the idea that even the lowest person, even an enemy, deserved a baseline of human dignity and material comfort. The American authorities observed this quiet internal crisis. They saw that the prisoners were physically recovered, but mentally entombed. The abundance of food and medicine had saved their bodies, but it had done nothing to bridge the gap between their shameful survival and their lost identities. The white mug was a start, a softening of the shell, but the Americans knew that to truly reach the men behind the masks of stoicism, they had to offer something more valuable than calories or caffeine. They had to offer the prisoners a way to reconcile the abundance of the camp with the void in their hearts. The stage was being set for the introduction of the mail system, an experiment in human connection that would test whether a piece of paper could weigh more than the mountain of imperial duty. In October 1944, the static routine of the camp was disrupted by the arrival of a small delegation from the International Red Cross, accompanied by American administrative officers. They carried with them not crates of food or medicine, but satchels of stationery and a formal decree that felt like a thunderclap to the assembled men. Through a translator, the announcement was made. Under the provisions of the Geneva Convention, every prisoner of war was now permitted to write 1 letter per month to their family in Japan. The Americans would provide the paper, the envelopes, and the postage. The prisoners were told that the letters would be screened for military intelligence, but otherwise, they were free to speak to their mothers, their wives, and their children. The reaction was not one of joy, but of a chilling, collective paralysis. To the American officers, this was a routine humanitarian gesture. To the Japanese prisoners, it was a psychological minefield. For months, they had carefully cultivated their anonymity, hiding behind false names and the assumed status of the dead. Now, they were being asked to create a paper trail that would lead directly back to their doorsteps in the prefectures of the home islands. The camp erupted into a low, frantic murmur once the officers departed. The men huddled in the barracks, debating the decree with a ferocity that had been absent since their capture. The prevailing sentiment was one of intense suspicion. The soldiers were convinced that the letter project was a sophisticated trap, a form of black propaganda designed by the Americans to identify their families for future retaliation or to use the letters to demoralize the Japanese public. They feared that by writing home, they would be handing the enemy a list of targets. Furthermore, the act of writing, "I am alive," was, in itself, a confession of the ultimate sin. To send such a letter was to officially notify the Japanese government that they had failed to die. It would strip their families of the honor of having a war hero and replace it with the social death of having a prisoner. The paper sat in stacks on the administrative tables, thin, white, and terrifyingly blank. For several days, not a single man stepped forward to claim a sheet. They looked at the stationery with the same apprehension they might have directed at a new type of enemy explosive. The white porcelain mug, once their only source of comfort, now sat beside them as they agonized over the choice. To remain silent was to remain dead, which was the honorable path. To write was to choose life, but a life defined by the permanent stain of capture. The abundance of the American camp had filled their stomachs, but it had not yet given them the courage to face the truth of their existence. The American guards watched this hesitation with a mix of confusion and pity. They could not fathom why a man would refuse to tell his mother he was safe. They did not see the invisible chains of the senjinken that bound the prisoners' wrists more tightly than any iron shackle. The camp leaders, senior non-commissioned officers who still maintained a shadow of their former authority, held hushed councils in the corners of the barracks. They warned the younger soldiers that the Americans were trying to steal their souls through the mail. They argued that a Japanese soldier's only letter should be a final testament written before a suicide charge, not a mundane update from a comfortable cage. Yet, despite the warnings and the deep-seated fear, the silence of the paper began to exert its own pressure. The human instinct to be remembered, to reach out across the void of the Pacific, began to gnaw at the younger privates and the older reservists who had left behind infant children. They looked at the white paper and saw not a trap, but a mirror. The internal fortress was under siege by a fundamental human need, the need to say, "I am still here." The decree of paper had forced a crisis of identity that coffee and clean beds could not reach. The prisoners were being forced to decide if they were still the property of the emperor or if they were men who belonged to their families. The first pen stroke was coming, and with it, the final collapse of the imperial facade. This abundance was also a form of isolation. The more the Americans provided, the further the prisoners felt drifted from the reality of their families in Japan. They imagined their wives and children lining up for meager rations of sawdust-filled bread while they, the cowards, were eating meat and fruit. The porcelain mug became a weight of gold, a treasure they felt they had no right to hold. It represented a standard of living that was inextricably linked to the democratic ideal, the idea that even the lowest person, even an enemy, deserved a baseline of human dignity and material comfort. The American authorities observed this quiet internal crisis. They saw that the prisoners were physically recovered but mentally entombed. The abundance of food and medicine had saved their bodies, but it had done nothing to bridge the gap between their shameful survival and their lost identities. The white mug was a start, a softening of the shell, but the Americans knew that to truly reach the men behind the masks of stoicism, they had to offer something more valuable than calories or caffeine. They had to offer the prisoners a way to reconcile the abundance of the camp with the void in their hearts. The stage was being set for the introduction of the mail system, an experiment in human connection that would test whether a piece of paper could weigh more than the mountain of imperial duty. In October 1944, the static routine of the camp was disrupted by the arrival of a small delegation from the International Red Cross, accompanied by American administrative officers. They carried with them not crates of food or medicine, but satchels of stationery and a formal decree that felt like a thunderclap to the assembled men. Through a translator, the announcement was made. Under the provisions of the Geneva Convention, every prisoner of war was now permitted to write 1 letter per month to their family in Japan. The Americans would provide the paper, the envelopes, and the postage. The prisoners were told that the letters would be screened for military intelligence, but otherwise, they were free to speak to their mothers, their wives, and their children. The reaction was not one of joy, but of a chilling, collective paralysis. To the American officers, this was a routine humanitarian gesture. To the Japanese prisoners, it was a psychological minefield. For months, they had carefully cultivated their anonymity, hiding behind false names and the assumed status of the dead. Now, they were being asked to create a paper trail that would lead directly back to their doorsteps in the prefectures of the home islands. The camp erupted into a low, frantic murmur once the officers departed. The men huddled in the barracks, debating the decree with a ferocity that had been absent since their capture. The prevailing sentiment was one of intense suspicion. The soldiers were convinced that the letter project was a sophisticated trap, a form of black propaganda designed by the Americans to identify their families for future retaliation or to use the letters to demoralize the Japanese public. They feared that by writing home, they would be handing the enemy a list of targets. Furthermore, the act of writing, "I am alive," was, in itself, a confession of the ultimate sin. To send such a letter was to officially notify the Japanese government that they had failed to die. It would strip their families of the honor of having a war hero and replace it with the social death of having a prisoner. The paper sat in stacks on the administrative tables, thin, white, and terrifyingly blank. For several days, not a single man stepped forward to claim a sheet. They looked at the stationery with the same apprehension they might have directed at a new type of enemy explosive. The white porcelain mug, once their only source of comfort, now sat beside them as they agonized over the choice. To remain silent was to remain dead, which was the honorable path. To write was to choose life, but a life defined by the permanent stain of capture. The abundance of the American camp had filled their stomachs, but it had not yet given them the courage to face the truth of their existence. The American guards watched this hesitation with a mix of confusion and pity. They could not fathom why a man would refuse to tell his mother he was safe. They did not see the invisible chains of the senjinken that bound the prisoners' wrists more tightly than any iron shackle. The camp leaders, senior non-commissioned officers who still maintained a shadow of their former authority, held hushed councils in the corners of the barracks. They warned the younger soldiers that the Americans were trying to steal their souls through the mail. They argued that a Japanese soldier's only letter should be a final testament written before a suicide charge, not a mundane update from a comfortable cage. Yet, despite the warnings and the deep-seated fear, the silence of the paper began to exert its own pressure. The human instinct to be remembered, to reach out across the void of the Pacific, began to gnaw at the younger privates and the older reservists who had left behind infant children. They looked at the white paper and saw not a trap, but a mirror. The internal fortress was under siege by a fundamental human need, the need to say, "I am still here." The decree of paper had forced a crisis of identity that coffee and clean beds could not reach. The prisoners were being forced to decide if they were still the property of the emperor or if they were men who belonged to their families. The first pen stroke was coming, and with it, the final collapse of the imperial facade. The standoff with the stationery lasted for nearly a week, a period of agonizing contemplation that saw the prisoners staring at the blank white sheets as if they were shards of glass. The first man to break the collective vow of silence was a corporal named Ichiro, an older reservist who had been a schoolteacher in a small village near Nara before the mobilization. He was a man of quiet disposition, one who had spent his months in the camp meticulously cleaning his white porcelain mug, finding a strange, meditative peace in the weight of the ceramic. On a Tuesday morning, under the watchful but disinterested eyes of the tower guards, Ichiro walked to the distribution table, his wooden clogs clicking rhythmically against the dry earth. The act of picking up the pen was a physical struggle. His fingers, calloused by the construction of fortifications and the recoil of a Type 38 rifle, trembled as they hovered over the paper. In the Japanese military, the hands were instruments of the state, meant for grasping the hilt of a bayonet or the spade of a trench. To hold a pen for the purpose of personal expression felt like a radical act of rebellion against the very essence of his training. The other prisoners watched him from the shadows of the barracks, their expressions a mixture of betrayal and desperate curiosity. By touching the paper, Ichiro was admitting that he was alive, that he was captured, and that he desired to return to a world that had already mourned him. The first stroke of the pen was hesitant, the black ink bleeding slightly into the grain of the American-made stationery. He did not write of the war, the politics, or the emperor. He wrote his true name, not the alias he had used since his capture, and the address of his wife. The physical sensation of writing his own name felt like reclaiming a soul he had cast aside in the jungles. As the ink flowed, the rigid posture of the soldier began to dissolve. The fortress of the mind, built on the cold foundations of the Senjinkan, could not withstand the simple, rhythmic motion of calligraphy. To write was to remember was to feel, and to feel was to realize that the shame of survival was a hollow weight compared to the love of a father. Ichiro's pen moved slowly, tracing the characters for health, safety, and abundance. He looked at the white porcelain mug sitting on the corner of the table, its steam rising in a lazy coil. He wrote of the coffee, of the white bread, and of the strange, confusing kindness of the men who were supposed to be his executioners. He was not writing a military report. He was composing a resurrection. The act was a private execution of the living dead persona he had inhabited. He was no longer a ghost of the imperial army. He was a man from Nara who wanted his wife to know that the wooden box she had likely received was empty of his spirit. When he finished, Ichiro did not look back at his comrades. He folded the paper with a precision that bordered on the sacred and handed it to the Red Cross representative. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a cracked dam. The other prisoners had seen the sky did not fall, and the Americans did not strike him down. They saw that Ichiro's face, though wet with tears he refused to wipe away, looked more human than it had in years. The first pen stroke acted as a signal. One by one, then in small groups, the other men began to approach the tables. The fear of the trap was being overwritten by a more powerful, primal urge to be known. The white paper, once a symbol of terrifying exposure, was becoming a canvas for the rebirth of the individual. The Americans watched the queue grow, noting the transformation in the men's eyes. The soldiers were no longer looking at the ground. They were looking at the paper, their minds already traveling across the thousands of miles of ocean to the homes they had been told were better off without them. The no-surrender code was beginning to bleed out through the nibs of 100 pens. Once the initial barrier had been breached by the schoolteacher from Nara, the psychological dam that had held back the prisoners' humanity for years disintegrated with terrifying speed. The barracks, once a site of hushed military discipline and the hollow stares of the living dead, were transformed into a feverish hall of scribes. Men who had not spoken a word of their past for months sat hunched over wooden tables or knelt on the concrete floors, their faces inches from the white stationery. The sound of the camp changed. The rhythmic clicking of pens and the rustle of paper replaced the heavy, stagnant silence. It was the sound of 200 men simultaneously attempting to re-enter the world of the living. The collective stoicism of the Japanese soldier, a trait cultivated through years of brutal physical conditioning and ideological purity, shattered under the simple weight of the pen. As they began to describe their lives, the facade of the warrior without a home collapsed. Documented accounts from the camp administrators describe a scene of profound emotional upheaval. Hardened NCOs, veterans of the slaughter at Guadalcanal and the starvation of the Northern Islands, were seen weeping openly, not with the quiet, dignified tears of a funeral, but with the racking, convulsive sobs of men who had suddenly realized the magnitude of their loss. They were not crying for their defeat, but for the years they had spent believing their families were better off with them dead. The blank sheets of paper became a mirror that reflected the absurdity of their previous devotion to the Senjinkan. To write the words, "I am alive," was to commit a definitive act of treason against the imperial army, but as the ink filled the page, that treason felt more like an awakening. The prisoners found that they could no longer maintain the mask of the anonymous ghost. The act of writing forced them to acknowledge their own names, their children's faces, and the smell of their home villages. The emotional release was so violent that some men were unable to finish their letters. They would collapse into their arms, their bodies shaking, the white paper beneath them becoming spotted with tears that blurred the ink of their shaky calligraphy. The American guards, who had expected defiance or perhaps a stoic acceptance of the male privilege, were unnerved by the intensity of the breakdown. They saw men who had faced flamethrowers and machine guns without flinching now reduced to trembling heaps by a 5-by-7-inch piece of stationery. This was the moment of ideological transformation. The prisoners began to see that the Americans had not given them paper to mock them, but because the Americans understood something the imperial command did not, that a man's identity is not the property of the state. The white porcelain mug, sitting beside the inkwells, became a silent witness to this shift. It represented the material abundance that allowed for such emotional luxury, the idea that a soldier could be more than a weapon. In this flood of emotion, the hierarchy of the camp dissolved. Officers and privates sat side by side, united by the shared shame of their survival and the shared hope of their reconnection. They were no longer a unit of the Emperor's army. They were a collection of displaced men realizing that the honor they had been promised was a cold and lonely substitute for the warmth of a letter. The psychological fortress had not been breached by a siege, but by an invitation. By allowing the prisoners to speak to the ones they loved, the Americans had dismantled the internal logic of the Japanese war effort more effectively than any naval bombardment. The men were no longer fighting for a seat in the Yasukuni shrine. They were writing for a chance to sit at a family table once more. The act of writing, while cathartic, soon gave way to a secondary, more agonizing internal conflict, the weight of the truth. As the pens moved across the American stationery, the prisoners were forced to navigate a moral labyrinth. They had to decide how much of their reality to reveal to a Japan that was being told every day that its sons were either victorious or dead. To write home was to inform their wives that they were now widows of a living man, a status that carried a social stigma almost as heavy as death itself. The letters were not filled with the patriotic slogans of the front lines. Instead, they were intimate, painful, and surprisingly domestic. The content of these letters, captured in the quiet scratch of graphite and ink, revealed a profound shift in priority. Men did not ask about the progress of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They asked if the persimmon tree in the backyard had borne fruit that year. They asked if their youngest son had started school, or if their aging mothers still had enough charcoal for the winter. These were the questions of men who had been stripped of their military identity and were desperately trying to reassemble the fragments of their humanity. The stark white paper became a bridge back to a mundane reality that the Senjinkan had commanded them to forget. However, the shadow of shame still loomed over every sentence. Many prisoners spent hours staring at a single line, debating whether to tell their parents they were in Hawaii. To admit to being in a paradise of American abundance while Japan was being firebombed felt like a final, unforgivable betrayal. Some chose to lie, claiming they were hospitalized in a neutral territory, while others were brutally honest, describing the white porcelain mug and the regular meals as a way of explaining why they had chosen to live. They were writing their own confessions, trying to justify their heartbeat to a culture that demanded their silence. The tension between the expected military bravado and the reality of their situation created a unique psychological pressure. In the Japanese army, a letter home was usually a yuigan, a final will and testament written with the expectation of imminent death. To write a letter as a healthy, well-fed prisoner was a subversion of that sacred tradition. The men felt the eyes of their ancestors upon them as they described the taste of American beef or the warmth of the barracks. They were caught in a vacuum between two worlds, the dying empire that viewed them as trash and the American system that treated them as men with a future. This internal struggle was reflected in the physical state of the letters. Many were wrinkled, stained with sweat and tears, and covered in crossed out lines where the writer had hesitated to speak too freely. The white paper, which had initially represented a trap, now represented a heavy responsibility. The prisoners realized that their letters would change the lives of those at home forever. They were sending a message of hope that was also a message of disgrace, a paradox that many struggled to resolve. The act of communication was not a simple release. It was a heavy, calculated risk. Beside them, the white porcelain mug remained a constant, grounding presence. Its solidity and simple utility stood in contrast to the complex, shifting emotions of the letter-writing process. It was a reminder of the physical world, the world of food, drink, and survival that they had once been told to despise. As they folded their finished letters, many men looked at the mug with a new sense of clarity. They were realizing that the truth of their survival was more important than the lie of their heroic death. The paper was their testimony, and the weight of that truth was the final blow to the mental shackles of the Imperial Army. As the letters were collected and the barracks returned to a semblance of order, a profound psychological shift took root within the camp, one that transcended the mere act of writing. The fortress of the mind had not just been breached, it had been fundamentally reconfigured. The Japanese prisoners began to view their captors not through the lens of wartime propaganda, but through the lens of their own restored humanity. For years, they had been indoctrinated to believe that the Western blue-eyed devils were a subhuman force of pure destruction. Yet, it was these very devils who had placed the pen in their hands and the white porcelain mug on their tables. The realization was jarring. The enemy was not interested in their shame, but in their survival. This shift in perception led to a gradual dismantling of the imperial ideology that had governed their lives. The prisoners began to observe the American guards with a new, analytical curiosity. They noticed that the Americans did not move with the frantic, fearful precision of the Japanese soldier, but with a casual confidence born of a different kind of strength. They saw that the American system functioned on a foundation of individual agency, a concept that was initially alien, but increasingly attractive. The bridge of paper had allowed them to step outside the rigid hierarchy of the emperor's army and view themselves as individuals again. Once a man acknowledges his own name and his own family on paper, he can no longer be a nameless cog in a suicide machine. The humanization of the enemy was inextricably linked to the American concept of abundance. In the Japanese military, scarcity was a tool of discipline. It was believed that hunger and hardship sharpened the spirit. But in the Kauai camp, the prisoners found that their spirits were not dulled by comfort, but rather awakened by it. The white porcelain mug became the primary teacher of this lesson. It was a sturdy, mass-produced vessel that provided the same warmth to the guard as it did to the prisoner. It symbolized a society so wealthy and so secure in its democratic principles that it did not need to starve its captives to feel powerful. This realization eroded the core of the Senjinkan. If the devils were providers of life and connection, then the honor of self-destruction began to look like a tragic, unnecessary waste. The transformation was visible in the daily conduct of the men. The lethargic, ghostly movements of the living dead were replaced by a quiet, focused energy. They began to take pride in the maintenance of their barracks and the cultivation of small gardens, using the same hands that had once held pens to grow food in the Hawaiian soil. They were no longer waiting to die, they were waiting for news. The psychological shift was a transition from the collective death cult of the empire to the individual hope of the post-war world. They were beginning to understand that their value was not tied to their utility as weapons, but to their existence as fathers, sons, and human beings. This shift was not without its own brand of pain. It required the prisoners to confront the reality that they had been lied to, not just about the Americans, but about the very nature of their own sacrifice. To accept the humanity of the enemy was to acknowledge the futility of the war they had fought. They felt a rising sense of indignation toward the commanders who had remained in Tokyo, safe and well-fed, while demanding that their soldiers perish for a shame that the Americans clearly did not recognize. The porcelain mug, always present, was a constant reminder of the physical reality that contradicted every imperial edict they had ever heard. By the end of 1944, the prisoners were no longer the same men who had waded out of the surf with their hands raised in terror. They were a community in transition, caught between a shattered past and an uncertain future. The act of writing home had anchored them to a world worth living for, and the kindness of their captors had given them a new framework for understanding power. They were becoming the first citizens of a new Japan, one that would eventually have to reconcile its ancient traditions with the overwhelming reality of global abundance and individual freedom. The living dead had been resurrected, not by a miracle, but by the simple, democratic belief that every man has a story worth sending home. In early 1945, the one-way bridge of communication finally became a two-way connection. The first mail bags from Japan arrived at the camp, their canvas sides marked with the red markings of the International Red Cross. For months, the prisoners had lived in a state of suspended animation, having sent their confessions into the void of the Pacific. Now, the void was speaking back. When the names were called out during the morning muster, the atmosphere was not one of military order, but of a congregation holding its breath. For the men who stepped forward to receive a thin, battered envelope, the physical contact with the paper was an electric shock. These were voices from a world they believed they had burned to the ground with their surrender. The arrival of the return mail completed the destruction of the imperial war effort within the hearts of the men. As they retreated to the corners of the barracks or sat beneath the shade of the eucalyptus trees, the letters revealed a Japan that was unrecognizable to the propaganda-fed soldier. They read of firestorms that had turned cities to ash, of a diet of acorns and sawdust, and of a desperate struggle for survival that made their own shameful life in a camp look like a palace. Most importantly, the letters were not filled with the expected condemnation. Mothers wrote of their joy that their sons were alive. Wives wrote that they had kept their husbands' clothes clean and ready. The social death they had feared was a phantom. Their families did not want heroes in the Yasukuni shrine. They wanted their men to come home. This revelation was the final blow to the Senjinkan. The prisoners realized that the rigid code of honor was a one-sided contract. While they had been prepared to wither away in silence to protect their families from disgrace, their families were praying for the very survival the code forbade. The contrast between the crumbling, starving empire and the security of the American camp was further highlighted by the physical artifacts within the envelopes. Small, hand-drawn pictures from children or pressed petals from a home garden were laid out on the barracks floor next to the white porcelain mugs. The mug, representing the industrial abundance of a free society, was now paired with the emotional abundance of a family's love. The two forces combined to create an unbreakable argument for a future beyond the war. The arrival of the mail also sparked a new kind of grief, a grief for the comrades who had followed the code to the end. The survivors looked at the letters in their hands and realized that thousands of their fellow soldiers had died in the mud of New Guinea or the caves of Iwo Jima for a shame that did not truly exist in the hearts of the Japanese people. The return mail acted as a psychological liberation. The prisoners began to speak more openly with the American guards, sometimes sharing the contents of their letters through translators. They were no longer guarding the secrets of a dead man. They were planning for the lives of the living. The psychological landscape of the camp had been permanently altered. The men were no longer living dead, waiting for a final judgment. They were students of a new reality. They watched the newsreels of the American advance with a complex mixture of sorrow for their country and a desperate hope for the end of the conflict. The abundance of the camp, the food, the medicine, and the constant, steaming presence of the coffee in the white porcelain was no longer viewed with suspicion. It was seen as the standard for the world they hoped to build. The return mail had proven that the bridge held firm. The individual had been reclaimed from the state, and as the men folded their letters and tucked them into their pockets, they were already beginning the long, internal journey back to the Japanese islands. By the final months of the war, the camp on Kauai had become a microcosm of a world in transition. The men who moved between the barracks and the mess hall were no longer the hollow-eyed specters of 1944. They were men anchored by the weight of the letters they carried in their breast pockets, thin sheaves of paper that served as a counterweight to the mountain of imperial duty. The fortress of the mind had been replaced by a quiet, contemplative resilience. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting a golden hue over the red earth, the prisoners would often gather in small groups, not to discuss the tactical movements of the front, but to discuss the reconstruction of a life. The bridge of paper had functioned as a spiritual conduit, drawing them out of a death culture and into a reality defined by the individual's right to exist. This transformation was the ultimate victory of the American system, achieved not through the violence of arms, but through the overwhelming weight of human consideration and material plenty. The recurring symbol of the white porcelain mug remained the silent protagonist of this shift. As the war drew to a close, the mug was no longer a confusing artifact of the enemy. It had become a familiar companion. It sat on the tables, steady and unyielding, a testament to a civilization that could afford to be merciful. In the steaming depths of the coffee, the prisoners had seen the reflection of a truth they were never supposed to know, that a nation's greatest power lies not in its ability to demand the death of its subjects, but in its capacity to provide for the lives of its citizens. The emotional collapse that had occurred when the men were first allowed to write home was not a sign of weakness, but the sound of the spirit breaking free from its shackles. The tears shed over the stationery were the first payments toward a new identity. By choosing to write, by choosing to be known, these men had performed a radical act of freedom. They had rejected the anonymity of the living dead in favor of the messy, painful, and beautiful reality of being a son, a husband, or a father. The letters they sent were the first blueprints for a post-war Japan, a nation that would eventually rise from the ashes of its own ideology to embrace the same abundance and global connection that had once terrified its soldiers behind the wire. As the day of repatriation approached, the prisoners prepared to return to a land that was physically broken but spiritually altered. They carried with them the memory of the camp, the taste of the coffee, and the heavy feel of the white porcelain. These objects would remain in their minds as symbols of a different way of life, one where the state served the man, rather than the man serving the state. They were going home as the first ambassadors of a new era, carrying the realization that the shame of their survival was actually the seed of their country's rebirth. The silence of the Kauai camp was finally broken, replaced by the murmurs of men who knew their names once more. The story of the Japanese POWs who broke down over their letters is a poetic testament to the enduring power of human connection. It reveals a larger truth about the nature of freedom and the ideology of abundance, that the most effective way to dismantle a system of oppression is to remind the oppressed of their own value. In the end, it was not the threat of the bayonet that conquered the imperial heart, but the offer of a pen and a sheet of paper. The abundance of a free society, manifested in something as simple as a warm meal, a clean bed, or a porcelain mug, is the ultimate weapon against the darkness of total war. It is a reminder that even in the depths of a global cataclysm, the smallest gesture of humanity can be the bridge that leads a man back to himself.